Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for students of counselling and psychotherapy. Here are your hosts, Rory Lees-Oakes and Ken Kelly.
Hi, I'm Rory, and with me is Ken. How are you, Ken?
Exceptionally well, Rory. Glad to be here. You've tuned into episode 139 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast, and we've got three topics that we hope that you will enjoy today. The first one is for student counsellors that are going out on placement, already on placement, and that is using your placement effectively. We then move into our check-in with CPCAB, where we're speaking about working with long-term clients. And Rory, you spoke with Ray van der Poel about this topic. What can we expect from check-in with CPCAB today?
Well, I mean, Ray really did concisely outline the difference between working in short-term therapy and working in long-term therapy. And I think it might be, certainly for our student colleagues, an interesting insight into the difference between working with fixed-term, maybe 6 or 12 sessions, and working in an open-ended way. So it's really insightful.
One not to be missed there. And we'll be ending episode 139 today, speaking about Practice Matters, which is our kind of section for our qualified practitioner. And we're speaking about working with child bereavement. So not a happy topic there, but an important topic nonetheless. And that's our job, I guess, Rory, here at Counselling Tutors, to speak about the topics sometimes that are pretty difficult to discuss. But we'll start off with our first topic, using placement effectively. Yes,
I mean, for a lot of students, and you may be on a level 2 course in the UK or an introduction course, you may be on a certificate course again in the UK or anywhere in the world, and eventually when you go to your practice or practicum, I think it's called, sometimes it's referred to, you go and work with clients, and to do that you have to get a placement. And certainly here in the UK, lots of charities offer opportunities for counsellors to come and work with them through their student training year or years. And I thought it would be really useful to explore and expand upon the great opportunities that are available when you work in a placement, when you work for an organisation that offers counselling. Because I think a lot of people just see it in a very one-dimensional way, very binary way, that it's just a case of, I'm going to go in, I'm going to see my client, and I'm going to come out again. But actually, if you sit and think about it, it is an absolute goldmine. A good placement is a goldmine to network and further your career. So what I would suggest is that if you're in a placement, have a real big think and start to talk to your colleagues and start to talk to the people who work in the organisation and get a real feel for it. What do they do? Who do they network with? What organisations are they paired up with? And you'll find a wealth of information. And the more that you find that information, the more that you can kind of flesh out, if you like, opportunities for when you're qualified. I know quite a few of my colleagues found paid work through their placement.
100%. You know, I've mentioned on a number of occasions, I'm going to say it again, Rory, I'm going to say it again. It's important to get a placement while you're studying, but it's more important to get the right placement. You want an organisation that is there, it's going to support you and offer perhaps a little bit of training in a specific area, in the area that the agency specialise in, but definitely support you through your studies at the very, very, very minimum. And you know, we're speaking about this as placement, and you might be listening to this as a qualified practitioner and going, well, that doesn't apply to me. But I think it does in a way, because when we're speaking about how to get the most out of your placement, it really kind of parallels how you would get the most out of working in an agency. And the first thing that I always suggest when looking at a placement, or even in looking at a permanent position in an agency, is check out the agency's policies and procedures. Get copies and go through them with a fine-tooth comb. Understand them, because these are kind of the rules of engagement that you're working to within your counselling relationship with your client. When you're in there with your client, you're working to the agency's policies and procedures. And if you're not 100% au fait with what they are, you can end up not serving your client in the best way, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. I think policies and procedures are an interesting one, because a lot of agencies mirror the work ethic of paid employers. So I think that by understanding how your placement works, that's a really important point, Ken, and I thank you for that, because it's an introduction to the world of work in the world of counselling, because it is a different, I worked in a commercial environment before I worked in, as a student counsellor, and it was completely different. The policies, the procedures, how we operated, the ethos of the organisation was completely different to anything I'd worked in before. And what served me very well during my training days was understanding how that, and I'm going to use the word business because they're funded, how that business worked, how it operated, what was the ethos of the organisation, how it operated on a human level and also on a professional level. And that you can take into any paid work that has counselling, I think. And of course, you can take up stuff like group supervision. What a wonderful opportunity. You have your own personal supervision. You may have supervision within your training provider. But hey, you can get group supervision and you can get different perspectives. I've sat in group supervisions and I've found some really, really rich, deep learning just from my peers and the person who facilitated it. So that's another really useful asset that you can take away with you when you're making the most of your placement. And also, of course, things that sometimes you may not be aware of, things like training opportunities. A lot of placements have a little pot of money for training, and if you go into we used to call it the brew room, you would call it the canteen now, or the coffee room, or whatever area people kind of socialized in. There's always a notice board, and you'd be surprised how many training opportunities come along, and you can take that up, and usually they're quite low cost, Ken.
Yeah. You mentioned networking in the beginning, Rory, and I think that's one of the most important things for me. And this is whether on placement or at a CPD conference or within an agency where you might be working. Build your networks. This is your career. No matter where you are on that career path, the more people that you interact with and the more connections you have, I guess the more power to you and the better you are maybe able to service your clients when that time comes. So if you're working within an agency, definitely find out where the referral pathways lead. So what are the agencies that your organization linked to in your area? So if a client comes in and it may be somebody that says they're in an abusive relationship, is there an organization in the local community that you can link them into? If they say they don't have enough food in their cupboards to get by, who do you refer them into? And you don't want to kind of be leaving that session, going away, speaking to your line manager, and then coming back. Make it your job to kind of find out what the referral pathways are within the agency or within your placement. And then another one that is often unseen, Rory, and this is one from your super duper handout, because we've got a handout for this that you can get, and the handout is called Getting the Most of Your Placement, and it's free of charge, and you can get that by going to our website, which is counsellingtutor.com. Click on the podcasts tab, find your way to episode 139. All of the show notes that we speak about today are there. All of the external links we reference are there. But there's also a super duper handout that Rory made called Making the Most of Your Placement. And one of the interesting ones on there that is kind of, I wouldn't have thought of, Rory, is when you're in your final years to training to become a counsellor, you're asked to do a research project where you're asked to take a topic, research on that, and then present your research maybe to your group and to write up that research. And it is a really good idea when you get briefed your research project to go to your placement and ask them if there's any issues that they have or that they can think of that you could do your research on. You may find yourself getting supported by your placement, shines a really good light on you. You were speaking about employment opportunities after placement, Rory, and it looks fantastic on your CV as well. So don't forget to get that handout. Lots of useful stuff on there.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, what you do in your placement, people will see you, people will meet you, and they'll get to know you. And you're absolutely right, Ken. Working in a placement, you're going to be linked to lots of other organisations, and depending on the client group and depending on how clients are, you may find yourself in contact with lots of different organizations if you have to do a referral, and you can make contacts there. It's amazing. Your network expands and your knowledge expands exponentially. And I also think that one of the really useful things to do after you've found where the kettle is to go to all the staff and find out exactly what they do, because that's useful. Because the people who work in an agency or a placement, they are a great. I'm not going to use the word assets, but great resources. Because if you have a client who's got difficulties, and it may be that counselling isn't the answer to those difficulties. Maybe someone comes in and just plumps in front of you a benefit form and says, "Can you help me fill this in?" If you know the right go-to person to help with that, that's really useful. You're not going to be kind of second guessing or confused. You can be really professional in your placement and say, if it's only the benefit form, because that sometimes happens. Clients come in, they get assessed. The problem they're assessed for kind of disappears. That can sometimes happen, and they've got another difficulty, and they come in and they think that they can just use you as a resource for that issue. So I've had clients who've come in, the referral said anxiety, and when they've come through the door, they wanted me to help fill in a housing benefit form. That's all they wanted. Now, if you know the right person to go to, that's going to make your life a lot easier and make you feel more confident in your practice. And you know what, Ken? It's amazing how often this topic comes up in our Facebook group. It's a perennial posting in our Facebook group. And if you don't know where our Facebook group is, go to Facebook, type in Counselling Tutor. You'll find us there. We're a closed group, but hey, knock on the door. We'll let you in. And you can mingle, if that's the word, with thousands of like-minded people. Some people are qualified practitioners. Some people are student practitioners, supervisors. There's a smattering of tutors in there, and at least one well-known researcher who pops in every so often to helpfully share his research, and come in and share your placement experiences. But yeah, placement's just such a rich seam of opportunity, is what I'd say. I'm going to coin that phrase, a rich seam of opportunity, Ken.
I like that. And it is an important topic. It is an evergreen topic. It does come up again and again. I want to mention, if you are a member of our paid for resources, which are our counsellor resources, so we offer a lot of free stuff, including this podcast. All the stuff on our website is free. Our Facebook group that Rory has mentioned is free, but we do have premium services. And I know that within our counsellor resources, Rory, you have created a full lecture called a placement workshop that kind of walks you through finding a placement, what you should be looking at in a placement. There's a lot of moving parts when it comes to a placement. Today we're speaking about, I guess, getting the most out of your placement. And just to end on that networking, when it comes to that networking, it's interesting. The networks you make in placement can sometimes be around far into your career. You don't know where those people will end up, who you might be sitting next to or in front of in an interview one day. And I certainly know from my study time, there are peers that were on my course that are now in pretty high up positions, and I have certainly been past work already as referral. So those networks are really, really important. And I must put in, if you're wondering about that premium service and that lecture that Rory did, just go to our website, counsellingtutor.com. All the information is there for you. So leaving the placement behind a little bit and going into our check-in with CPCAB, the UK awarding body, by counsellors, for counsellors, and they bring a topic on a weekly basis. They really support our podcast, and today it's working with long-term clients. It's Ray Thunderpool that you spoke to, Rory.
Yeah, I was just playing the recorded excerpt before we came to record. I think what's really interesting is Ray brings a wealth of knowledge, because he's a former lecturer himself and a very experienced practitioner, and he talks very succinctly and very passionately about the difference between maybe short-term therapy, where you may be working with a client for maybe 6 or 12 sessions, which is relatively brief in the panoply of counselling and psychotherapy. I'm working long term with clients, and what that asks of you And I think that his observations are enlightening.
Let's check in with CPCAB.
Check in with CPCAB.
And we're here with Ray, and we're talking about working long-term with clients. So welcome, Ray.
Hi, Rory. Thank you. Always a pleasure to talk on your podcast. I really wanted to begin to explore with the listeners this idea that when we're training, we go through our placement, and some of the placements that we go to have very limited amount of sessions that we do with clients. And what the difference is between working for a longer period of time than maybe 6 to 12 sessions. And I just wanted to maybe highlight a case study, obviously anonymized, of when I was training. And I was training, working with women with substance misuse issues. And I remember sitting down and this was part of my placement, so very, very fresh. And probably a really hard placement as far as complexity is concerned.
Mm-hmm.
We had a lot of support around us. But I remember sitting down in the first session, and my client was very, very anxious, very nervous. And I was speaking with her, and she almost was you could see her having a conversation with herself. And after about the third session, being new to counselling, I sort of brought up the courage to say, well, can you tell me a little bit about what's going on for you? And she started explaining all these different voices that she had in her head. And she had about 5 different voices that she would listen to. And I suppose if we sort of link that to person-centered, we'd be talking about configurations of self, something like
Yeah.
potentially. But I'm just going to call them for ease parts. So different parts of herself. And she had a very difficult childhood. There's a lot of trauma there, and hence where these configurations or parts had come from. And I remember that having taking this to my supervision and saying, actually, this client wants some form of diagnosis, and I don't know if that's going to be really helpful for them. And my supervisor at the time said, well, does the client want that? I said, well, yeah, well, the client's asked for that. So he said, well, why don't you support her in that? So I supported her in that, and she came out with the diagnosis of PTSD, suffering from PTSD symptoms, and that almost began to change the session. And when I reflected on that, it was all about me being supportive in what the client wanted to do. And no matter how that sits with your own thoughts around symptoms, diagnosis, it wasn't my decision. So I think that was one of the learnings that I took. And I'd only worked with people for quite short periods of time with a different type of therapeutic approach. But this was the first time in person-centered, and it sort of, things began to progress through the sessions. The person calmed down with anxiety. They began to talk through their self-configurations. We were able to explore the different parts of that person. And it all of a sudden, after about 18 sessions, the relationship began to change into a different depth of relationship. I suppose that is what I wanted to bring to people's attention, is that actually and it might happen after 6 sessions, at this particular time it happened after 18, and there was a different depth of relationship. It was almost as if when I moved, they moved. When they moved, I moved. There was that relational depth that I hadn't experienced before. And I just think that is so important to try and capture, that actually it's going to be different for all different types of practitioners, but it gives a different type of relationship. Now, interestingly, after that, I had this experience of wanting to give more of myself to that person. So not in necessarily a physical way, but I wanted to begin to tell them a little bit about what's going on for me. And that was very scary. And that I took straight to supervision.
Yeah.
But this idea that when the relationship changes, when you gain a different depth, then you're more prone to other things happening within that relationship. And one of them was this need I had for me to be able to tell somebody else what was going on for me. And that was a couple of supervisions as well.
Yes.
Exploring what was going on for me. But I think that's another thing that, with relationship depth comes different challenges in working with somebody.
Absolutely. And I think from my experience, Ray, and from what you're saying, part of that is how much of self to give away, how much of self to share. And I think that one of the absolute formative people on this is Patricia Clarkson. I remember I've got a copy in the library here of the therapeutic relationship, and she very, very cleverly, I thought, said that a good therapeutic relationship is equivalent to talking to a cousin, because you are distant enough to remain subjective, but close enough to know the other. And I think that is a really interesting angle. And you're absolutely right, Ray. With the way that services are, and certainly for students in practice, some could go across their entire training never hitting relational depth because they haven't physically got enough sessions to build that relationship.
Yeah, it's so important to be able to experience things. And as a new practitioner as well, I'd always argue if I was in a placement, and I'm not saying what placements should offer, that's not what I'm saying.
No.
But I would like to explore at least one in my training, at least one longer term type of therapeutic relationship, just to begin to experience those subtle differences.
Yeah, and I really can identify with that kind of hump that you've talked about, where you kind of work with a client and all of a sudden you find yourself in a completely different space, a completely different therapeutic space, where you are now connected with the client and you're having to kind of think, how much of my authenticity, how much of my real self should I share? How present shall I be in the service of the client? And I think you're absolutely right. That's one for supervision, certainly for novice therapists to explore, and a good supervisor will try and get a sense of, can the clients absorb that? Can the client absorb that part of you? Because with some clients that might be difficult. They may see the relationship completely differently to you.
Yes. Oh, for sure. And this idea of how much to share with somebody was a real. I remember that real tough struggle as a student of walking that line, and this idea of what is relational depth? How much this empathic response that I had. Where does it live? And I like the way you've described that. And for me, it lives in between and around the relationship. It's not one side or the other. It's objective enough for me to go, I can see it. Yeah,
it's what we would call intersubjective, where both the parties can see it and almost on a very visceral level of feel it. And of course, perhaps a topic for another podcast. That then brings us, of course, to the inevitable endings and how one works with endings with long-term relationships. That definitely is another podcast, but
that would be amazing. I when I was teaching, I always say, well, how do you leave a party? That gives you a good idea of how you process your endings. Are you the person that goes around to everyone and tells them you're leaving? Are you the person that sneaks out the back door? Are you how you leave a party? Just have a think about that. That's always a good indication.
Yeah. Well, that's really, really useful. And, as always, Ray, we value your insights. It's a pleasure to talk to you. But relational depth, it's a very real part of counselling. And hopefully, and this is a real hope for me, one that students and indeed practitioners find, because it really is the meat and potatoes of what we do. It's where the work's done, I think.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, Ray, it's always a pleasure talking to you, and thank you very much.
Check-in with CPCAB is proudly sponsored by CPCAB, the only awarding body run by counsellors for counsellors. To learn more about CPCAB qualifications and to get more detailed information on today's podcast topic, visit cpcab.co.uk.
Well, Ken, what can I say? It's such an insightful observations that Ray was making, certainly around things like boundaries. The boundaries as the relationship starts to develop, and also the congruence. As how the congruence develops, the more that you get involved in the relationship. So, food for thought there, Ken.
It is indeed. And, I think about it in terms of just relationships in general. If you meet somebody and you kind of know them for 8 weeks, and then you meet someone else and you know them for 2 to 3 years, it's a very different level of relationship, and it definitely needs to be considered as something different. And you don't know when a client becomes a long-term client, really. I know I've had clients that have come in to my private practice just for a few sessions, and 2 years later have still been there and had a need to be there. Of course, you need to be assessing that need is still there and you haven't built up dependence. But of course, always a big thanks to our good friends at CPCAB for that amazing topic.
Practice Matters.
Practice Matters is proudly sponsored by Backpack. Backpack is a user-friendly client management software product designed especially for counsellors and psychotherapists. Get a 30-day free trial of Backpack and 30% discount by using the discount code CT2020. www.bac-pac.co.uk. So Practice Matters is basically a section for our qualified practitioner, or for students that are considering what they might do at the end of their student journey. So continuing professional development.
Yeah, we're going to be specifically talking about working with children who've had a bereavement. So it might be a child who's lost a parent or a sibling, and how we work with them. I was very fortunate a few years ago to do a CPD, a 35-hour CPD with an expert in child grief, how children grieve, and it's very, very interesting. And there's things that children do, which is no surprise that adults don't. So the first thing is how children experience loss, and it's really interesting. The training I did, the trainer said even babies experience loss. Very small children, they may not be able to conceptualize it. They may not be able to, fully understand it, but they experience the loss of a parent. And I found that quite amazing, because I would have before the training, I would have just thought, small babies probably wouldn't have known, but apparently the research says that they do. And one of the things that I took away from this, Ken, was you really do, if you're working with children, you really do have to understand the child grieving process. Now, I did a lecture on this, and the lecture kind of explains the child grieving process. And it is a very, very kind of structured development over the arc of their own development. So children who are very young, I'm talking toddlers, maybe 3, 4, 5, may actually exhibit magical thinking. They may think actually the parent's going to come back, and they may very well, fantasize that, the parent will just materialize again. And if you're a parent or a therapist, you have to be very, very thoughtful and work with that, and very kindly but very truthfully help them understand that the parent isn't going to return. So it needs a lot of sensitivity, and it needs that kind of work, needs a real solid understanding of child development, Ken.
Yeah. And if you're wondering about that lecture and you want to check that out that Rory did, we have a whole section for qualified practitioners on continuing professional development from top names in the counselling sector, I guess, that we get in and they do formal lectures. And Rory, you did one on working with children who have experienced bereavement. And more information of that, you just go to counsellingtutor.com. That's where you can pick that up. It is different. You can't take an understanding of the grieving cycle and then sit down with the child. It's about understanding where their understanding is, how they're experiencing it, what their phenomenological experience of that process is. And like you say, Rory, the younger child may well not be able to understand the finality of death. How can you at that age? It hasn't kind of been cemented in. It's as a young child that you kind of get shown that by maybe the death of a pet or the death of a grandparent or something like that as you kind of grow. But when it's really close to you and you're so young, it can be really difficult to understand.
Yeah, agreed. And I also think that in terms of working with bereavement, it is a very specialised field, and a lot of people Google it and come across Kubler-Ross's work, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and the DABDA acronym, which is denial, anger. Oh, you got me now. Denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. There we go. That's not bad. And it's not a really useful model. It's not a really useful model actually for nowadays for working with adults. The reason that they had that model was it was the easiest for professionals to explain to clients, apparently. And there's some more really kind of in-depth and a little bit more complex models. But when it comes to working with children, you as I said, I know I'm repeating myself, but you really do need to have an understanding of child development and their cognitive development, what they will understand. And one of the things that they talk about, and I talk about, is using clean language. And clean language isn't what you might think it is, not using swear words or profanity. Clean language is using vocabulary that a child would understand. I think it's very easy as adults for us to use words that children don't understand. And as a therapist, you've got to use very precise, very clean language. And as I say, I outline what that is. And I think the other thing with child bereavement is that children may blame themselves. I've worked with children who have had experienced bereavement, and somehow they think it's their fault. They, as you say, children have a different experience of the world than adults do, and that's not surprising because adults have got more experience of the world. Because as you get older, you get more experience, and they have a different phenomenology. They have a different perception, a different reality of the world. And sometimes you find yourself working with a child who actually believes that they may have broken something and it's caused the death of a parent, and you have to work with that. So it's very, very, very delicate work, very thoughtful work, and it does take a degree of training. I don't think it's something that can be gone in. I'm going to be open about this with just a diploma in counselling or a counselling qualification. I think you need extra training to be able to do this and really support very, very young clients.
I'm glad we discussed this topic, Rory, and I'm very glad that you mentioned the kind of the more well-known cycle of grief. And it's really interesting how well publicized that is, because you'll hear it coming from friends, family members, from clients who will mention that cycle, and the misconceptions on that are great, that it is considered a linear process, that you will start at one point and you will, and I'm mentioning this because you haven't, when we're talking about kind of grief and complex grief, you've done a number of lectures which are all available from our CPD section, counsellingtutor.com. Go and check that out if you're interested, which kind of outline that there are various models, and it is a complex topic. It is something that definitely needs further investigation, further study, but it's an important place because, when you were mentioning that some children feel that maybe they are responsible in some way, my little heart sank as you said that, Rory, of how lost that little soul is, saying if I hadn't been naughty, if I'd have been good, if I'd have done this, if I'd have done that, how horrific. So what a privilege if you have that kind of understanding, you understand how to work with that, to be with somebody and kind of hold them through that really, really difficult time. Really, we're called sometimes, Rory, to go into dark places, But I guess hopefully we're shining a light in those dark places.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, the old adage of know thyself is so important. One of the things that I took away from my child and adolescent therapy, the child and adolescent therapy courses that I've done, and also the child bereavement modules that I did on those courses, was that you have to know yourself. So you have to understand, with great precision, I think, your own history of bereavement and your own attachment style, because it's very, very easy to get lost in that kind of work. As a therapist, you're working with a very young child. They're going through a very difficult time, and you have to be really aware of your own process. That's what I would say, and of course, that inevitable. I mean, we can't have the podcast without me mentioning transference and countertransference, but it's a real living thing, and it's very, very. I've worked with therapists as a supervisor who have, really identified with that young person. And saw themselves in them, and there is a danger there that over identification, and you can go down that very difficult rabbit hole where the therapist is working with the client, but really they're working with themselves and unprocessed grief. So the whole of the piece really needs not just training, but a real strong element of personal development and understanding of self.
Indeed. It's just, again, Rory, when we speak about these topics, that kind of reinforcement, how important it is to do the continuing professional development, to not just get your graduation diploma, get your certificate, and off you go into practice. We need to be dipping in all the time. There's such depth to what we do, and it's for that reason that Rory is our academic director and recognized some time ago that we need a CPD provision in Counselling Tutor. We do so well at providing learning resources and learning lectures for our students, but we've now made the focus onto our qualified practitioner as well. It's CPD that you can do from the comfort of your very own home. Rory's got a ton of lectures in there, but we've also got external lecturers that have come in on specialist topics, and they're not too long as well. You're not committing 3 days to learn about a topic. You can pop in within an hour and a half. You've got a good understanding of a topic. That doesn't necessarily qualify you to go out and practice that bit of stuff that you've learned, but it gives you enough understanding, enough information that if you wished to, you could kind of delve a little bit deeper. Great for kind of working out career paths, things like that. And of course, all of that information is just counsellingtutor.com. What an episode, Rory.
Absolutely. Well, we started off by using your placement effectively. We explored a little bit about the opportunities that are bountiful in a placement. And then we listened to Ray van der Poel from CPCAB, who really outlined the difference between working in a short-term way with the clients and working in a long-term way. Really interesting. Talked about boundaries and how our congruence may develop. And then finally, not a happy note, but a essential note to end on, I think, is how to work with children who experienced a bereavement. So, as always, stay grounded and stay safe.
Take the stress out of your counselling studies and get the support of Rory and I by joining us in the Counselling Study Resource. Counselling Study Resource, or CSR for short, is the world's most comprehensive assignment guidance and study support resource for students just like you of counselling and psychotherapy. See how Counselling Study Resource can help you. Visit counsellingtutor.com. That's counsellingtutor.com.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Find the show notes for this episode on our website at www.counsellingtutor.com.